Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. It was a hot and humid summer day in 2022. As she ventured deeper into the Amazon, 40-year-old Lilian, with her desire for discovery, decided to go on a hike. Born and raised in a remote village in Brazil, she had spent much of her life surrounded by nature. For her, hiking was not just a sport, but a form of spiritual purification, a mental relaxation. Entering the depths of the forest reminded her of the pure and natural state of life, helping her find a lost peace. That day, in the early morning hours, she set out on a forest trail to experience the tranquility of nature. Lilian was always well prepared for her hikes, bringing along a water bottle, some snacks, and her phone. But that day something felt different. The heat, the humidity of the forest, the eerie silence. All of it seemed to trap her in a magnetic field. As she moved deeper into the forest, she began to lose track of time. Her eyes were lost in the vast green of the Amazon. The dense vegetation around her was so thick that she could hardly hear her own steps. But after a while, she realized something was wrong. She had unwittingly lost her sense of direction. At first, she thought it was just a temporary situation. Perhaps she would turn around in a few minutes and find the right path. But as the hours passed, a sense of fear began to settle in. Nothing around her seemed familiar. The sun was beginning to set. The cooling air and the darkening sky gradually made Lilian aware of the reality of being lost. She tried to get a signal from her phone several times but failed. As her phone fluttered uselessly in her bag, the desperation of a woman lost in the depths of the forest grew stronger. She wasn't alone. The shadows of the forest felt like a threat drawing closer with each step. At first, she didn't want to admit that she was lost. "I'm just a little off track," she thought. "I'll walk a bit more and turn back." But as the night approached and the sounds around her changed, those reassuring thoughts started to fade. The nature she once felt safe in now seemed like a hostile forest. She decided to spend the night in the forest. With plenty of fruits and water sources around her, she thought she could make it through the day. What had started as a simple walk was now a fight for survival. The next morning, the soothing sounds of nature filled the air, but to Lilian's ears, they sounded like a threat. Normally, these sounds would give her peace, but now they echoed in the ears of a woman lost in the wilderness. Her family still didn't know she was lost in the forest. But with each passing hour, the hopelessness of the search became more evident. Lilian's husband was waiting for her. As the days passed, with no word of her whereabouts, they began to grow more worried. Her love for nature and her courage had always been well known, but this time, anxiety set in. No calls, no messages, no news came through. Eventually, her family contacted the local authorities to report her disappearance. News of Lilian's disappearance quickly spread. People from nearby villages and towns volunteered to search for the lost woman in the forest. Many locals had ventured deep into the jungle, but the forest, like a labyrinth, blocked their way. As the days went by, there was only uncertainty and darkness surrounding Lilian's disappearance. Authorities intensified their search efforts, but the complex structure of the forest made the search more difficult with each passing hour. Lilian was still alone in the forest. She had to make a decision: somehow survive and find her way out, or let the forest slowly swallow her. When Lilian became lost in the forest, she only had a small backpack, a water bottle, and a few snacks with her. These were the basic preparations for a simple hike. She had never been prepared for such a situation. The lack of phone signal marked the beginning of one of the darkest moments of her life. The nature she once trusted so much had quickly turned into a deadly enemy. At first, she thought she would only be lost for a few hours, but as time passed, she began to face the reality of her situation. She started to realize everything. She was alone. The lack of phone signal was a harsh reminder that she was on her own. She had no chance to call for help, and on the first night she had to find a place to spend the night. The forest, which was so green and peaceful during the day, turned dark and eerie as night fell. As the day passed, she began to review everything she knew about the nature around her. The once soothing greenery and bird sounds of the forest now felt so alien that it was inevitable to perceive every tree, every sound, every movement as a threat. There was nothing around her that could make her feel safe. She was alone with the fear of being a woman lost in the depths of the forest. On the first night, she was so lonely and scared that she didn't even blink for a moment. The strange sounds that seemed to penetrate into the forest in the darkness made her feel that at any moment she could face danger. She had no means of defense. She could only fight the darkness around her. Several times, strange screams and the chilling sounds of reptiles echoed in her ears from a distance. As she slowly surveyed the area where she had spent the night, she found nothing but a puddle of water and some tropical fruits. At first, this seemed like a salvation, but the challenges of trying to survive in the forest were much greater. She was carefully rationing the water in her bag to make it last for days. The nights were cold, and the days were almost unbearably hot. The heat made her need for water increase with each passing day. In the first few days, she survived on fruit and rainwater. The forest offered her limited living space, but she had lost her way further from there. Slowly, she began to shift between hopelessness and fear. She stopped by the riverbank several times to drink, but the forest around her seemed to turn into a dark labyrinth. While trying to find fruit, she was also searching for a safe place to spend the night. As time passed, the threat of predators grew. In the Amazon rainforest, every corner hid a deadly danger. One day, when she heard a loud roar, she quickly turned her head and found herself staring into the eyes of a large jaguar. Fear engulfed her, but her survival instincts kicked in. After staring at her for a while, the jaguar slowly walked away. But the incident deeply shook Lillian. While running from predators, she was also constantly aware of the presence of insects, spiders, and poisonous snakes. Her body began to be covered in bites. Surviving the night became a torment as she feared that at any moment, an insect or an animal would harm her. Hunger grew stronger with every passing hour. The snacks in her bag were quickly running out, and she was reducing the amount of water. Her body was weakening and her energy was fading. But in order to survive in the forest, she had to resist and find strength in any way she could. In these first few days, she felt as though she was walking the fine line between life and death. Every step, every movement was a struggle to keep herself alive. In the following days, Lillian continued to search for the lost hope that she had once had. Each new day became another phase of her survival struggle. But with every step, she hoped that her survival instinct would give her the strength to keep moving through the forest. Each moment in the forest carried hope for taking another step. As hunger and thirst grew stronger, she also felt a deeper connection to nature. What once comforted her now challenged her to save her life. Since the moment Lillian got lost in the forest, she realized that with each passing day, her struggle for survival had become a brutal game. The exhaustion from the first few days had nearly drained her body, but mentally she was still strong. Each new day was an opportunity to survive even longer. However, as time passed, dark thoughts like hunger, thirst, and loneliness began to fill her mind. The future seemed more uncertain with every passing minute. One day, as she desperately looked around, an idea came to her. Water. Water sources in nature were usually near signs of civilization. Water was not only the greatest need for survival, but it could also be the starting point of a path that might lead her out. This thought seemed like a ray of hope. She thought she might be able to find various water paths throughout the forest, and perhaps these paths could lead her to an exit that might save her. This decision gave her a sense of purpose and direction. Following the water sources erased some of the hopelessness she had been feeling. However, while these thoughts provided short-term relief, the challenges of the forest were far greater and more complex. As she moved along the stream, she slowly began to lose her sense of direction. The dense tree canopy of the forest grew with every step. The moisture from the rain and the puddles of water around her feet were pulling her down step by step. At first, following the stream was relatively easy, but with each passing minute, she noticed that the water was becoming more turbulent and rocky. The closing paths and the increasing complexity of every movement within the forest were gradually exhausting Lillian psychologically as well. While she continued to follow the water, she repeatedly asked herself, "Where is this path taking me?" But there was no other choice. She had to follow this path to somehow keep moving and stay alive. One day, as she followed the stream, she suddenly heard a sound from above. The distant sound of a helicopter made Lillian's heartbeat race. The sound was quite far, but at that moment, she clung to the last glimmer of hope. Help was on the way. The rescue teams had found her. Perhaps they could spot her in just a few more minutes. She quickly changed direction and began to move toward the sound of the helicopter. But she was so deep within the dense forest that, despite the noise of the helicopter, no one noticed her. After a while, the sound of the helicopter faded away. For a moment, she thought it was all over. The hope that had briefly appeared suddenly disappeared like a fleeting light. Slowly, she sat down and rubbed her face with her hands. "Why wasn't I noticed?" she thought. Her morale plummeted. Her eyes filled with tears, but her survival instinct forced her to stand up again. "I have to get through this. No giving up," she thought. That day, Lillian continued to move forward, lost once again in the dense forest. But this time, the disappointment inside her began to push her harder. On one hand, the limits her body was giving her, and on the other hand, the collapse of her mind, were becoming a heavier burden with every step. Still, she kept going. With each step, her body ached more, her energy drained, but somehow she pressed on. As she moved forward, her frustrations grew. There was no sign of the rescue teams, and the helicopter sound she had once heard had turned into mere fantasies. The forest, while keeping Lillian occupied with false hope, was also making the surrounding landscape feel more and more narrow and suffocating. Yet, at the same time, she tried to reconnect with nature. Fruits, water sources, trees, everything began to carry meaning. Even though she was lost deep within the forest, she was trying to internalize the lessons the forest was teaching her. 1. Morning, before the sun had risen, Lillian wearily left her place. She had lost her way, but there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe just a few more steps, maybe just a few more minutes. These thoughts pushed her once again to seek hope. Between the darkness of the night and the uncertainty of the day, she found an inner strength to survive. She was a lost woman, but she was also alone with a lost hope. As time rapidly passed in the depths of the forest, Lillian's body began to slowly deteriorate. Days chased one another, but each passing minute made her struggle for survival even harder. Under the hot sun, her body was drying out from dehydration. Her muscles ached, and her bones felt weak. Her mind grew increasingly foggy, and with each passing moment, she moved forward not with the instinct to survive, but with a sense of hopelessness toward mere survival. Her eyes, tired and helpless, scanned her surroundings as she seemed to be slowly moving toward death. At first, the fruits and water sources that nature provided had kept her alive for a while, but now these resources had run out. All that was left was the grim forest, the unrelenting heat, and cracked lips from dehydration. She was slowing down more with each passing day. Taking a step or raising her arms became a great effort. Thirst had enveloped every cell in her body. Her skin felt like it was drying out. The water she had drunk was gone down to the last drop, and at that moment, she knew that in order to survive, water had to be accessible once again. One day, unable to bear the weight of the backpack on her back any longer, she sat down. A few days earlier, she had hoped more from the water source she had found, but now returning there seemed pointless. The landscape around her blurred with dizziness, and thoughts of death began to creep into her mind. Once a strong, brave woman, connected to nature, Lillian was now just a depleted body. For a moment, she could feel her heart slowing down, but at that moment, she heard a rustling from deep within the forest. She tried to focus on the sound, but she had almost no strength left. The sound was closer now, and something was approaching rapidly. As her vision blurred, she weakly turned her gaze. Suddenly, she noticed a snake slithering towards her, long and terrifying. The snake's eyes held the coldness of death itself. Lillian's heart suddenly began to race. This woman, exhausted, hungry, and weak, was only seconds away from facing death. As the snake rapidly approached her, Lillian's body seemed frozen. She had no strength to move. Though her mind imagined escaping the snake's fangs, her body's response was too slow. The snake's head, mouth open, prepared to strike, ready to sink its venomous fangs into her. In that moment, she thought her final moments had come. Death was so close. In a second, perhaps even a minute, everything converged. Courage, fear, and surrender. But just at that moment, her survival instinct kicked in once more. With one last burst of energy, Lillian managed to push the snake's head away. Her hands trembled as she tried to shove it off, her fingers grabbing its cold, hard skin. And with a final effort, she pushed it away from her. The snake quickly recoiled. Lillian, for a moment, closed her eyes as her body collapsed to the ground. A chilling silence enveloped her. On the fine line between life and death, she almost disappeared. But something kept her alive. Perhaps something was still holding her together. Slowly, she tried to get up, shaking. She was so weak that each step felt like she might fall, but she didn't give up. She was searching for a glimmer of hope to keep her alive. Her eyes scanned the nature around her, once a source of strength and confidence, but now everything seemed to blur into uncertainty. A few steps later, she realized she had come across a water source. Her eyes were searching the water almost hungrily. She quickly plunged her hands into the water and began drinking, but the water tasted bitter. Her body was still dehydrated, but drinking somehow made her feel a little stronger. Lillian didn't see this moment just as a way to survive. It was also an inner resistance. Her body was weak, but her spirit was still standing tall. In that moment, she had faced death. However, surviving the snake's attack reminded her once again how precious life was. Slowly but determinedly, she began to take steps again. Surviving. The day created new hope for the next. With each passing second, that inner strength that kept her alive became clearer, and step by step, she continued to battle death. Lillian was growing more and more exhausted each day. Lost in the depths of the forest, she had already pushed her body to its limits in her struggle to survive. With one final effort, she tried to keep going, but eventually, she reached a point where she thought it was all over. She had neither hope nor strength left. However, in her darkest moment, a miracle occurred. One morning, while walking through the forest, her eyes were almost completely shut. Her body had already surrendered to dehydration and hunger. As she took her final steps, her vision began to blur. She tried to push forward, struggling to cover a few more meters. Each step felt as if she was facing death. Just one more step. Perhaps just a few more seconds. It was such a small thing that if Lillian could see it, she might have found a reason to hope. But in the depths of the forest, there was nothing but the shadows of bushes and trees. Slowly, she collapsed to the ground, experiencing a moment when she almost lost herself completely. She was so weak that as she slowly fell to the earth, her heart was racing, but weakly, she searched for a glimmer of hope. Then, in those final moments, she noticed something, a sound. Very distant, but a sound. Far away, amidst the noises carried by the wind, there was something that resembled a human voice. Suddenly, her survival instinct kicked in. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she raised her hands into the air. She was so weak that her hands barely moved, but she still tried to do something. After a while, the distant voices became clearer. It was as if nature itself was trying to help her. The sounds grew closer. Her ears picked up the sound of a group moving forward. A few minutes later, figures, following the trail of a lost person, approached Lillian. A group of fishermen heading toward the sea had noticed the strange figure. At first, they didn't understand what it was, but when they looked closely, they saw a weak, collapsed human figure on the ground. They approached slowly to check her condition. Lillian opened her eyes and, with her hands raised, signaled to the fishermen for help one last time. Her body was so weak that her hands trembled in the air, but she had never lost hope. As she waited for their help, no words came from her lips. She simply showed with her hands the only remaining hope she had for survival. The fishermen exchanged looks of shock and fear before quickly springing into action. As they tried to assess whether she was still alive, they rushed to her side and gently lifted her from the ground. Lillian, struggling, barely managed to open her eyes and looked at the fishermen with gratitude, attempting to communicate something, but her body and voice were so weak and exhausted that no words escaped her lips. The fishermen immediately recognized that she urgently needed medical help. At that moment, Lillian's tired and exhausted body was carried toward the fishermen. Using their strength, they quickly placed her into a boat. With every passing second, every minute, a glimmer of hope for her survival began to emerge. As the boat sped across the calm waters of the ocean, the fishermen simultaneously called for help while trying to reassure Lillian. Her body trembled, every movement causing her pain, but she continued to fight for survival. After some time, when the boat reached the shore, an ambulance arrived immediately and rushed Lillian to the hospital. In that moment, she realized she was part of a miracle. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses immediately began treating her. Her body was so dehydrated that the doctors found her blood to be the weakest and most dehydrated they had ever seen. She had lost so much weight that even as her body began to heal, it would take a long time to recover from the effects. That moment marked a turning point in Lillian's life. Her frail body symbolized a miracle to every doctor who treated her. Her internal organs were severely weakened, and her muscles had almost completely vanished, yet Lillian had managed to survive. As her body slowly began to heal, the doctors continuously applied treatments. Having survived for 34 days, Lillian had finally emerged from this dark journey, safe and sound. The trauma and exhaustion she had endured were still fresh in her mind, but she felt stronger with each passing day. The recovery process would be long, but Lillian was now alive, undergoing treatment at the hospital, and fully aware of how miraculous her survival had been. After 34 days of nightmare, a miracle had given her a second chance at life. When Lillian was first brought to the hospital, neither her body nor her mind recognized her own self. She was so weak that the doctors and nurses struggled to accept that what had happened to her was far beyond the realm of imagination. Her fight to survive had not only been physical, but also emotionally and psychologically draining. Yet here she was. She had survived. The miraculous rescue of a woman lost in the Amazon jungle for 34 days would soon become a story that would never fade from people's minds. Her first days in the hospital were almost like a near-death experience. For many days, she not only needed to recover physically, but also to heal her mind and spirit. Every muscle in her body ached, and every movement felt like an effort. The doctors had placed her in intensive care and started her treatment. Dehydration, hunger, and exhaustion had caused permanent damage to her body. But there was one undeniable fact. Lillian had survived. At first, her body was so weak that even opening and closing her eyes required tremendous effort. Slowly, as days went by, she began to move, speak, and eat. The doctors continued to believe that her survival was nothing short of a miracle. Throughout this difficult period, the medical team came to realize how strong Lillian's spirit was and how she had pushed her body's limits to overcome this ordeal. She was more than just a woman who had been lost. She was a hero who had conquered nature. During her days in the hospital, she continuously faced the emotions of fear, loneliness, and despair. Even though her body was beginning to heal, the memories of those 34 days haunted her like a ghost. The loneliness she felt while lost in the forest, the snake attack, and the fear she experienced while fighting hunger and dehydration all left scars in her mind. But at the same time, these experiences had reshaped her. She had started rediscovering herself, finding her inner strength once again. Every day in the hospital, as her body healed through physical therapy, she also made progress towards spiritual recovery. Her family, friends, and the people around her, who visited her in the hospital, began to understand better the struggles she had gone through and the inner strength that had kept her going. What astonished everyone was Lillian's resilience. She was a woman who never gave up easily. And years later, when her story was told, many would be in awe of her survival strength. After Lillian was discharged from the hospital, the world began to see her through different eyes. The media had heard her story and started to recognize her as a hero. The survival battle of a woman lost in the Amazon jungle had quickly become a global sensation. Her name was now more than just the name of someone who had gone missing. Lillian had become a hero, someone who had conquered nature, pushed the limits of human resilience, and demonstrated what survival truly meant. Over time, she began to accept the nightmares and memories in her mind. Each passing day, the harsh face of nature, which had once nearly taken her life, taught her to appreciate life anew. Nature had given her both a near-death experience and the strongest lesson in valuing life. As Lillian rebuilt her life, she learned to cherish every moment and understand how precious survival was. Once physically healed, Lillian began sharing the experiences she had lived through during the 34 days she was lost. She was no longer just the heroine of a survival story. She had become a symbol of never losing resilience in the face of any challenge. As she received offers for conferences, interviews, and book deals, she shared her experiences and the battle she had fought against nature with a growing number of people. She wanted to inspire others and help them discover their own strength. While recounting her time lost in the jungle and the fight for survival over 34 days, Lillian wasn't just telling her own story. She was conveying a deeper message, that every person has a hero within them. She emphasized the importance of mental strength and willpower, while also stressing the significance of pushing human limits against the power of nature. She was no longer just a woman lost in the jungle. She was a symbol of survival. Her return to life was a turning point, not only for her own life, but for the lives of others as well. Lillian's story was one of courage, perseverance, and victory. During those 34 days, the battle she fought against nature not only gave her a chance to survive, but also helped her rediscover the meaning of life in its fullest sense. She was no longer the lost woman of the past. She was a woman who understood how valuable life was and how essential inner strength could be.